If you'd asked me a month ago, I would have said Emily and I were doing fine. Not perfect, but solid. We'd been married for 10 years, built a life together, a modest house, shared routines, and an unspoken understanding of each other. She taught 3rd grade, always coming home with stories about her students, and I managed IT for a mid-sized company. It wasn't exciting, but it worked. So when she suggested we take a few trips to spice things up, I didn't think twice. It'll be fun, she said, her smile lighting up the room. We need this, don't you think? I agreed, eager to make her happy. If anything, I thought it'd bring us closer. The first trip was to a lake resort Emily had read about online. Rustic but charming, she'd said as she showed me the photos of cozy cabins overlooking the water. When we arrived, it looked just like the pictures. The air was crisp, the lake shimmered under the sun, and the sound of birds filled the silence we'd been living in for months. For the first day, it felt like a dream. We kayaked, walked along the shoreline, and laughed about how out of shape we were climbing the trails. But by the second day, something shifted. Emily seemed distracted. She'd check her phone more than usual, her gaze lingering on the lifeguard at the pool, a lean, tan guy who looked like he'd walked straight out of a fitness magazine. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was the kind of guy anyone might notice. But then I caught her watching him when she thought I wasn't looking. Her laugh was too easy when he joked with her, her smile too wide. I told myself I was imagining things, but the feeling lingered. That night, as we sat by the fire outside our cabin, I tried to shake the unease. What did you think of today? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She didn't look up, poking at the embers with a stick. It was nice, she said, her voice light. Her words were fine, but there was something in her tone, something distant. The next morning, I woke up early to surprise her with coffee from the little cafe near the lake. But when I got back, she wasn't in the cabin. Her phone was still on the nightstand, her sandals by the door. I checked outside and saw her by the pool, laughing at something the lifeguard said. I didn't approach. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there for a moment, the cup of coffee cooling in my hand, wondering if I was being paranoid, or if this was the beginning of something I couldn't stop. When Emily came back to the cabin that morning, she seemed lighter, like the tension I'd felt between us the night before had completely vanished. She had that easy smile on her face, the one that always made me think everything was fine. You're up early, she said, noticing the half-empty coffee cups on the counter. You didn't wake me. I thought you'd enjoy sleeping in, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I didn't mention where I'd seen her earlier. What was I supposed to say? That I'd watched her from a distance, trying to read too much into the way she'd laughed at another man's joke. We spent the rest of the day like any couple on vacation, renting bikes, exploring the nearby trails, and snapping photos by the water. Emily was animated, pointing out small things like the patterns on the bark of a tree or the colors of the sunset. She even pulled me close for a selfie, which caught me off guard. I forced myself to smile, but my mind was still replaying the morning by the pool. By evening, we were back at the resort, and Emily suggested we visit the lounge near the main building. They have live music tonight, she said, tugging on my arm. Let's go. I agreed, hoping a change of scenery might quiet the unease in my chest. The lounge was cozy, filled with soft lighting and the faint hum of conversation. A guitarist strummed in the corner, playing slow, familiar songs that matched the mood. Emily ordered a glass of wine, and I stuck with my usual beer. For a while, it felt almost normal again. She leaned closer as we talked, her hand brushing against mine, and I wondered if maybe I'd imagined everything after all. But then, he walked in. The lifeguard. He wasn't in his uniform now, just jeans and a casual button-down, but he carried the same effortless confidence. He spotted us, or rather, spotted Emily, and made his way over. My stomach tightened as I watched him approach. Hey, he said, his voice warm and familiar, like they were old friends. "I didn't expect to see you here." Emily looked genuinely surprised, her eyes lighting up. "Oh, hi," she said, a little too enthusiastically. "This is my husband, Mark." She gestured toward me, and for a split second, I thought I caught a flicker of hesitation in her expression. The lifeguard turned to me, his hand outstretched. "Chris," he said, his smile wide and easy. "Nice to meet you." I shook his hand, gripping it just a little harder than necessary. "Mark," I said, forcing a polite smile. "We were just enjoying the music." Chris nodded, his eyes flicking back to Emily. "It's a great spot, isn't it? I come here all the time." "I didn't realize you were staying at the resort," Emily said, tilting her head in that curious way she had. "Just for a few days," Chris replied. "Needed a break from work." He glanced at me, then back at her. "I was actually about to grab a drink. Mind if I join you?" I wanted to say no, to tell him this was our time, not his. But Emily was already sliding over to make room for him. "Of course," she said, and I clenched my jaw as he took the seat beside her. The next hour was a blur of small talk. Chris was charming, effortlessly drawing Emily into conversation about her job, her hobbies, even the books she'd been reading lately. He asked me a few polite questions too, but it was clear where his attention lay. Emily, for her part, seemed completely at ease. She laughed at his jokes, her body angled slightly toward him, and I found myself gripping the edge of the table just to keep my frustration in check. Eventually, Chris excused himself to grab another drink, and I seized the moment. "You two seem to get along well," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Emily shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "He's nice." "It's not a big deal, Mark." "It feels like a big deal," I said, my voice lower now. "At least to me." She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You're overthinking this. Can we just enjoy the evening without making it something it's not?" I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as Chris returned, sliding back into the seat beside her, I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my stomach. The next morning, Emily was radiant, her mood almost unnaturally bright. She moved through the cabin with a bounce in her step, humming a tune I didn't recognize. It was a stark contrast to how I felt, heavy, unsure, caught in a mental tug-of-war between trusting her and listening to the nagging voice in my head. I tried to match her energy, asking simple questions to keep the conversation light. "Sleep well?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Like a rock," she replied, flashing a quick grin at me through the bathroom mirror. Her reflection seemed carefree, even a little playful. But something about her cheerfulness felt off, like a mask that didn't quite fit. We spent the morning out on the lake, renting a small paddleboat. Emily seemed genuinely relaxed as we drifted across the water, pointing out the patterns the sunlight made on the ripples. "Look at that," she said, gesturing toward a cluster of ducks gliding past us. I nodded, smiling faintly, but my focus wasn't on the lake. I was watching her, searching for any clue that might confirm or deny my growing fears. The unease only deepened when she pulled out her phone. She turned slightly away from me, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Work stuff?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah, just a coworker," she said without looking up. There was a slight edge to her voice, like she was trying to brush me off before I could ask more. I let it go, though my chest tightened as I watched her slip the phone back into her bag. By late afternoon, Emily suggested we split up for a bit. "I thought I'd check out the spa," she said, her tone casual. "You could take that fishing lesson you mentioned." I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to be apart from her. The idea of her wandering the resort on her own, or worse, not on her own, left a sour taste in my mouth. But I didn't want to come off as clingy or suspicious, so I forced a nod. "Sure," I said, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. We parted ways near the main building. As I turned toward the dock, I glanced back over my shoulder. Emily was walking toward the spa entrance, her posture relaxed. At first, I felt a flicker of relief. But then I saw him, Chris, standing near the edge of the building, just out of sight from most guests. His hands were in his pockets, his body angled as if he were waiting for someone. My chest tightened as I watched Emily approach him. She didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him directly, but her pace slowed slightly as she walked past. He turned, falling into step behind her, and together they disappeared around the corner. I froze, torn between confronting her then and there or letting it play out. My heart raced as I turned back toward the dock, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I thought I'd seen. But the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. Dinner that evening was tense, though Emily didn't seem to notice. She sat across from me at the table, playing with her food, her fork tracing slow circles in her mashed potatoes. Her mind was elsewhere, and for once, I couldn't tell where. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "So, how was the spa?" She looked up, startled, like she'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, it was nice," she said quickly. "Relaxing." Her answer felt rehearsed, and I pressed further. "What did you do? Massage? Facial?" "Massage," she said, nodding too quickly. "The hot stone kind. It was, really soothing." I studied her face, searching for cracks in her composure. "That sounds nice," I said evenly. "You were gone for a while. Must have been a long session." She shrugged, taking a sip of her wine. "Yeah, they were running behind, so it took longer than I expected." I wanted to believe her, but the image of her walking with Chris earlier in the day burned in my mind. The timing didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. We sat in silence for a while, the clinking of silverware filling the space between us. Finally, Emily spoke, her tone lighter. "I ran into Chris today," she said, as if it were an afterthought. My fork paused mid-air. "Oh?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yeah, just in passing," she added quickly. "He mentioned he's heading out tomorrow." I nodded, trying to gauge her expression. "That's good," I said carefully. "He seems like a nice guy." Emily smiled faintly but didn't respond. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes fixed on the candle flickering between us. Later that night, as we settled into bed, the tension between us felt palpable. Emily turned away from me, her body curled toward the edge of the mattress. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Every small detail, her laughter at the pool, the way she brushed off my questions, the glance she shared with Chris, played on a loop in my mind. I reached out, my hand brushing her shoulder. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. She shifted slightly but didn't turn to face me. "I'm fine," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. But she wasn't fine. And neither was I. The morning was calm, but my thoughts were anything but. Emily woke up late, stretching and yawning as though she'd had the best night's sleep in months. "What's the plan for today?" she asked casually, pulling on a soft sweater. "I was thinking of taking a canoe out," I replied, sipping my coffee. "Maybe do some fishing." I left the sentence open-ended, waiting to see if she'd suggest joining me. Instead, she smiled faintly. "That sounds nice. I might check out the shops in town. There's a boutique I saw on the way in." I nodded, trying not to show how her answer stung. "Sounds good," I said, forcing a smile. We went our separate ways not long after. I paddled across the lake, hoping the quiet would help me sort out my swirling thoughts. But every time I tried to focus on the sound of the water or the rhythm of my strokes, my mind drifted back to her. To Chris. To the look on her face the night before when she casually mentioned running into him. By the time I returned to the cabin, Emily's car was gone. I stood in the driveway for a moment, feeling the stillness around me. A part of me wanted to drive into town, to find her and see for myself what, or who, she was really doing. But another part of me, the part that hated the idea of what I might discover, held me back. Instead, I busied myself with small tasks. I tidied up the cabin, checked my emails, even skimmed through a book I'd brought but hadn't touched. None of it distracted me for long. The hours stretched on, and the cabin felt emptier with each passing minute. Then, around mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily, "Won't be back until later. Don't wait for me for lunch. Red heart." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. For a moment, I considered calling her, asking where she was, who she was with. But I stopped myself. Instead, I typed, "Okay. Be safe." She didn't reply. When Emily finally returned, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. She walked in with a lightness I hadn't seen in a long time, a faint glow in her cheeks. "Hey," she said brightly, setting her bag on the counter. "How was your day?" "Quiet," I said. "How was town?" "Good," she replied. "Didn't buy anything, though. Just browsed." Her tone was casual, but I couldn't help noticing the way she avoided meeting my eyes. I wanted to press her for details, to ask if she'd seen Chris, but something held me back. Instead, I nodded and let the conversation drift to safer topics. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, Emily seemed relaxed, even happy. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a moment, I let myself believe things were normal. But when she excused herself to go inside, I stayed behind, staring out at the dark lake and wondering how much of this was real, and how much was slipping through my fingers. The next day started slow. Emily slept in again, and I let her, sitting on the porch with my coffee, staring at the lake. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet, and I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of us at birthdays, anniversaries, vacations. In each one, her smile was the same, bright, genuine, full of warmth. But now I wondered how much of it had been real. When she finally emerged, her hair still damp from the shower, she seemed chipper. "You're up early again," she said, pulling her sweater tighter around herself against the cool morning air. "Habit," I replied, setting my mug down. "I was thinking of heading into town today. Maybe check out that cafe you mentioned." Her smile faltered for just a second, so quickly I almost missed it. "Oh, yeah," she said. "It's cute. You'll like it." She hesitated, then added, "I was actually thinking of spending some time at the pool. I could use a little sun." It wasn't unusual for her to want some time to herself. But the way she said it, her voice just a touch too breezy, put me on edge. "Sounds good," I said, keeping my tone neutral. We went about our day separately again. I drove into town, wandering through shops and grabbing a coffee at the cafe. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the resort. To the pool. To Chris. By the time I returned, the parking lot near the pool was nearly empty, but I recognized Emily's sandals resting by a lounge chair. I hesitated, standing by the car, debating whether to walk over or head back to the cabin. A few steps closer, and I spotted her sitting at the far end of the pool, her legs dangling in the water. Chris sat beside her. I stopped dead. They weren't touching, not exactly, but their heads were close, their postures relaxed in a way that felt too familiar. I stepped back, heart pounding, and turned away before either of them could see me. Back at the cabin, I paced the small living room, every worst-case scenario running through my head. Was it innocent? Was I overreacting? Or was this the confirmation I'd been dreading? When Emily finally walked in, her skin flushed from the sun, I pretended not to notice. "How was the pool?" I asked, keeping my tone casual as I set my book down. "Nice," she said, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "Quiet. Hardly anyone there." I nodded, forcing myself not to react. She didn't mention Chris. She didn't say anything that hinted at what I'd seen. And that, more than anything, left me reeling. That night, the air in the cabin felt heavier than usual. Emily moved around with ease, humming softly to herself as she folded a blanket and tidied up the kitchen. I sat at the small dining table, pretending to scroll through my phone while stealing glances at her. Every movement, every glance she avoided meeting, felt like a clue I couldn't quite piece together. "Want some tea?" she asked, her voice light as she filled the kettle. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound indifferent. She busied herself at the stove, her back to me, and I couldn't stop the question from bubbling up. "Did you see anyone you knew at the pool?" Her hand paused briefly over the kettle before she turned, her expression carefully neutral. "No, why?" "Just curious," I said, shrugging. It seemed like a quiet day. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin smile. "It was peaceful, actually." She turned back to the stove, but the pause, just a fraction of a second too long, sat heavy between us. The tea arrived in silence. We sipped quietly, neither of us saying much, the hum of the ceiling fan filling the gaps. I wanted to ask her more, to push, but I didn't know how to start without sounding accusatory. Instead, I stayed silent, the weight of my unspoken doubts pressing harder with every minute. Later, as we lay in bed, the distance between us felt like miles. She drifted off quickly, her breathing slow and even. I stared at the ceiling, unable to relax, the image of her with Chris by the pool looping endlessly in my mind. Was I imagining things? Reading too much into a harmless moment? Or was there something deeper at play, something I didn't want to admit to myself? The next morning, Emily suggested we visit a nearby hiking trail. "It's supposed to have amazing views," she said, her voice bright. I thought it could be fun to do something together. Her suggestion caught me off guard. After days of spending time apart, this felt like a step back toward normalcy. I wanted to believe it was genuine, that she was trying to reconnect, but part of me couldn't ignore the nagging thought that it might just be a distraction. "Sure," I said, masking my hesitation. "That sounds good." The trail was steep but beautiful, winding through tall trees and opening up to a stunning view of the lake. Emily was in high spirits, snapping photos and pointing out small details, a cluster of wildflowers, a hawk circling above. I tried to match her energy, but the tension inside me wouldn't ease. "Isn't this amazing?" she asked as we reached the overlook, her cheeks flushed from the hike. "It is," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you suggested it." She leaned against the railing, gazing out at the water. For a moment, she looked completely at peace, like nothing had ever been wrong. I wanted to hold on to that moment, to let myself believe that everything was fine. But as she turned to me, her smile soft and fleeting, I couldn't ignore the flicker of guilt I thought I saw in her eyes. The hike had left us both tired, but Emily seemed invigorated. Back at the cabin, she was unusually affectionate, leaning into me on the couch and brushing her fingers lightly over my arm. It was the kind of warmth I hadn't felt from her in weeks, maybe months. "You okay?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft. I looked at her, startled by the question. "Yeah, why?" She shrugged, her gaze dropping. "You've been quiet. More than usual." For a split second, I considered spilling everything, telling her about the doubt, the pool, the moments I'd been holding back. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even say? That I didn't trust her? That I'd been watching her like a stranger? "Just tired," I said instead, forcing a small smile. Her expression softened, and she nodded. "Yeah, me too." But later that night, as she curled up beside me in bed, her hand resting lightly on my chest, the nagging questions came rushing back. Was this real? Or was she compensating for something she couldn't bring herself to admit? The next day, we had no real plans. Emily suggested we take it easy, maybe have a picnic by the lake. It seemed like a good idea, a chance to reconnect, to push aside the doubts and just enjoy being together. We found a quiet spot by the water, a small clearing shaded by tall pines. Emily unpacked the food she'd prepared, a mix of sandwiches and fresh fruit. "It's perfect here, isn't it?" she said, her eyes on the lake. "It is," I agreed, though my gaze was more on her than the view. She was radiant in the sunlight, her smile easy and unguarded. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I'd let my own insecurities twist something innocent into something ugly. Then her phone buzzed. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching for it. I watched as her eyes scanned the screen, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah," she said quickly, locking the screen and tucking the phone into her bag. "Just a work thing." But the way she avoided my gaze, the way her body tensed ever so slightly, set my pulse racing. I didn't press her. I didn't need to. The moment was already spoiled. Back at the cabin that evening, I excused myself to the porch, claiming I wanted to watch the sunset. In truth, I just needed space, room to think, to piece together the fragments of doubt that were steadily becoming too big to ignore. And then I saw it. Her phone, left on the kitchen counter. Unlocked. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Crossing that line felt like a betrayal of my own, but the weight of everything I didn't know was crushing me. Slowly, I stepped inside and picked it up. At first, nothing stood out, texts from friends, emails, harmless notifications. But then I found a thread that had no name, just a single initial, C. The messages were vague, almost coded, but the tone was unmistakable. "Thanks for today," one read. "Can't wait to see you again before you go." My breath caught. My grip on the phone tightened as I scrolled back through the thread, my stomach twisting with every message. And then there it was, a photo. Emily, smiling by the pool, Chris beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The phone slipped from my hand onto the counter. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Everything I'd been trying to push aside, every doubt I'd tried to suppress, came crashing down all at once. When Emily walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, I was still standing there, frozen. "Mark," she said, her voice tentative. "What's wrong?" I turned to face her, the phone still lying on the counter. "You tell me." Her eyes flicked to the phone, and in that instant, I saw the truth in her face. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Emily's eyes darted between my face and the phone on the counter, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You tell me," I repeated, my voice low but steady. "Mark," she started, taking a small step forward. "It's not what you think." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my chest, but I swallowed it. "Then explain it to me. Tell me why there's a photo of you and Chris in your messages. Tell me why he's texting you things like, 'Thanks for today.'" Her face paled, and she clasped her hands together like she was trying to hold herself steady. "It's innocent," she said quickly. "We've just been talking. That's all." "Talking," I repeated, my tone flat. "Is that why you lied about seeing him at the pool? Why you've been sneaking around this entire trip?" "I haven't been sneaking around," she protested, her voice rising. "You're twisting this into something it's not." "Am I?" I snapped, my frustration finally boiling over. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been spending our vacation getting cozy with another man. And now you're trying to convince me it doesn't mean anything." Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might fight back. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So it's true," I said, my voice hollow. You've been, what? Flirting with him? More than that? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. We connected, that's all. He listened to me. He made me feel. She stopped herself, but it was too late. He made you feel what? I demanded, stepping closer. What is it that I'm not giving you, Emily? What am I not enough for? Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might say something, anything, that would make this hurt less. But instead, she just stood there, silent. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally broke free. I trusted you, I said, my voice shaking. For 10 years, I've been by your side. I've given you everything I could. And this is how you repay me. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to hurt you, Mark. I swear. But you did, I shot back. You don't just stumble into something like this. You made a choice, Emily. You made a choice to let him into your life, knowing what it would cost us. Tears streamed down her face now, but they didn't soften the knot of anger and betrayal tightening in my chest. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to gather my thoughts. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. Mark, please, she called after me, but I didn't stop. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp against my skin, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I paced the small clearing in front of the cabin, my mind racing with everything she'd said, and everything she hadn't. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the life we'd built, the trust I'd always taken for granted. And now, all of it felt like it was slipping through my fingers, replaced by something hollow and uncertain. When I finally went back inside, Emily was sitting at the table, her head in her hands. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red and swollen. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think this was something we could come back from. But as I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, all I could feel was the weight of her betrayal. I think you should leave, I said quietly. Her eyes widened. What? I need space, I said firmly. Go stay somewhere else. I can't do this right now. She hesitated, like she wanted to argue, but then she nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. As she packed a bag and walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and despair. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence was heavy, like it was holding all the things we couldn't say to each other. And for the first time in 10 years, I felt truly alone. The morning light filtered through the cabin's thin curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. I sat at the table, my coffee untouched, staring at the bag Emily had left behind in her rush to leave the night before. It sat near the door, a glaring reminder of everything that had happened. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Emily. I'm staying at the main lodge. I'll give you space, but please let me know when we can talk. I didn't reply. What could I say? That I needed more time. That I wasn't sure if there was even a point to talking anymore. The hours dragged. I tried to distract myself, cleaning, organizing, even flipping through old emails, but none of it worked. My mind kept replaying her words, her excuses, the way she looked at me when I confronted her. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't sit still any longer. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, wandering down the narrow path that led to the lake. The air was crisp, and the sound of water lapping at the shore did little to calm my nerves. I found myself near the resort's main lodge, though I hadn't meant to go there. The parking lot was busy with cars coming and going, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But then I saw her. Emily was standing by her car, her back to me, her phone pressed to her ear. I froze, watching from a distance as she spoke, her hand gesturing slightly as though she were explaining something. I told myself to walk away, to respect the space I'd asked for, but I couldn't. Instead, I stepped closer, staying out of sight behind a cluster of trees. Her voice carried faintly in the still air. I know, but I just need a little more time, she was saying. There was a pause, and then she sighed. I can't just leave like that. He deserves better than this. My chest tightened as the words sank in. I didn't need to hear the rest to know who she was talking to, or about. I stepped out from behind the trees, and her head snapped around, her face paling as she saw me. Mark, she said, her voice barely audible. I kept walking, stopping a few feet away. Who was that? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. She hesitated, her hand gripping the phone tightly. It's not what you think, she said finally. Don't, I said sharply. Don't tell me it's not what I think. I've heard that enough already. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I saw you, I continued, my voice rising. At the pool. By the lodge. I've given you every chance to tell me the truth, and you keep lying to my face. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't want to hurt you, she said softly. Too late for that, I shot back. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had gone unsaid hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Emily looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said. I didn't plan it. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. And Chris, he made me feel seen again. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. Seen. I repeated bitterly. I've spent 10 years trying to make you happy, trying to give you everything you've ever wanted. And you're telling me I wasn't enough? That's not what I'm saying, she said quickly. It's not about you, Mark. It's about me. I've been so lost, and I didn't know how to tell you. You should have tried, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You should have told me before you let someone else into our life. I didn't let him in, she said, her voice cracking. It just happened. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Things like this don't just happen, Emily. You made a choice. And now we're both paying for it. She wiped at her tears, her hands shaking. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither do I said. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, I felt like I was looking at a stranger, a woman I'd shared a life with but no longer recognized. I need to go, I said finally, stepping back. Mark, she started, but I held up a hand. Don't, I said. Just, don't. I turned and walked away, my footsteps heavy against the gravel. I didn't look back, even when I heard her muffled sobs behind me. When I reached the lake, I stopped and stared out at the water, my chest aching with a pain I couldn't put into words. Whatever came next, one thing was clear, things would never be the same.